Brazil. So today we're going to address some of the same topics. So if you look at our lesson here, it says Slavery Part 1. And in our Slavery Part 1 lesson, we're going to look at slavery from a worldwide perspective. And then in our next lesson, Slavery Part 2, we're going to look specifically at the history of slavery in colonial America and what became the United States. So I think we should jump right in. So the first heading says Slavery in World History. So number one, it says the origin of the word slave. The word slave in English comes from the word Slav. So a Slav was somebody from an Eastern European country. So it's important to note that in the Middle Ages, people from Eastern Europe were captured and used as slaves. And because Eastern Europeans were slaves, that's where the name slave comes from. So the idea that these Slavic people were the workers, that's where the word was taken from. Okay. And then number two, this is it's a simple question, but important question. It says, did slavery exist in every society in the history of the world? The answer is yes. So if you go back and you look at every human society, let's start in ancient times. Ancient Greece, there was slavery. Ancient Rome, there was slavery. Ancient China, there was slavery. India, slavery. And even among Native Americans, Native American tribes enslaved each other. So I think it's important to note that even though we focus on slavery in American history, slavery was something that existed all over the world. But I will say that in America, the form of slavery was, I don't know what word I would use, but maybe a little bit more intense or severe than some other forms of slavery throughout the history of the world. Now, number three, this is a little bit of I don't think it's complicated, but I'm going to explain it very slowly. So 3 says the historical stages of slavery. And what I mean by that is, what were the reasons for enslaving another human being throughout the history of the world? So when we think of slavery historically, we think of race-based slavery, enslaving someone because of the color of their skin. But it's important to understand that the color of your skin was not always the reason for enslavement. So let's go through them. So in ancient times, the reason why one group of people enslaved another had to do with war. So 2 groups of people would fight a war against each other, and the loser of that war, the people who were captured, would either be killed or enslaved. So basically, it didn't matter what color you were. It didn't matter where you were from. If you were the loser of a conflict, you were captured and sold into slavery. And that was during the ancient times. And then when you get to the Middle Ages, the reason why people enslaved other people was mostly based on religion. So, if somebody was Muslim, you wouldn't enslave someone who was also a Muslim. But if somebody was a Christian or some other religious belief, you could enslave them. All right. So the idea during the Middle Ages was that you only enslave people of a different religion. And people who were pagans, people who believed in multiple gods, the god of this, the god of that, they were enslaved by both Christians and Muslims. So during the Middle Ages, Eastern Europeans, those Slavs, they were pagans. And that's one of the many reasons why those people were enslaved in such large numbers. And then we get to what, as Americans, we are familiar with. Starting in the 1400s, human beings started enslaving other human beings based on skin color, your race. So Europeans began to justify slavery based on skin color starting in the 1400s. And during this time period, this is when Africans become the dominant labor force on American plantations. And then later in our lesson today and then into tomorrow, we're going to try to figure out why race-based slavery became so dominant in the Americas and what advantages it gave to plantation owners. Okay, our next heading says, did racism cause slavery? So historians have this big debate, and the debate is basically, did racism towards people with dark skin cause slavery, right? Or did slavery cause racism against people with darker skin? So another way to phrase that is it's sort of like the old saying, right? What came first, the chicken or the egg? It's like a circular argument. Did Europeans enslave Africans because Europeans were already racist? Or did Europeans come to think lesser of darker skinned African people because of hundreds of years of slavery? We'll never have an answer to that question, but we do know that some Europeans did assume that because the color black was viewed as a negative color, like an evil color, or it had symbolic meaning, that potentially Europeans saw Africans as lesser people because of the negative ideas about the color black. Okay. And another historians argued, hey, listen, when you enslave a group of people for hundreds of years, of course, it's natural to want to think lesser of them. We'll never have an answer to this question, but I would like you just to be aware of the debate. All right. So we know that Europeans who colonized America were religious. So what did the Bible have to say about slavery? Well, we know that there were absolutely references to slaves in the Bible. And what historians think is like stories like the Curse of Ham and other stories like Exodus that had slavery. Historians think that because Europeans saw references to slavery in the Bible, that slavery was something that was, allowed by God and was okay. And the ironic thing was that slaves actually used the Bible when they converted to Christianity to fight against their condition as slaves. So the masters used the Bible to support slavery, and the slaves used the Bible to fight against slavery, which is, very confusing, but very true. All right. So then it says, how did African people end up becoming slaves, right? So number 7 says the most common reason that a person in Africa became enslaved was by being captured as a prisoner of war. So it's important to understand that African tribes fought each other all the time. And when one tribe would lose, the other tribe would sell the losers to Europeans for money. So Europeans did not have to capture the slaves themselves. Slaves were waiting for Europeans on the African coast. So in a way, it is true to say that Africans sold fellow Africans into slavery. But to understand this thoroughly, in Africa, people from different tribes did not view themselves as Africans. They spoke different languages, they had different cultures. So with the modern eye, you might say, African people betrayed their own kind or their own race and sold Africans to Europeans as slaves. That's not the way they viewed it in Africa, right? Just like how in America, Native American tribes were all different, and just like how in Europe, every country was different, in Africa, every tribe viewed themselves as a separate entity. So then it says other reasons for the enslavement of African people included being in debt or getting kidnapped or being punished for a crime, or some people were so poor they sold themselves into slavery. And then some people were just so desperate because they didn't have any food. All right. So if you were a captured African person, right, you would get sent to a place. It was either referred to as a slave castle or a slave fortress. And these were these humongous buildings on the western coast of Africa. And this is where slaves would wait for European ships to come. Then they would be shackled around their necks and their hands, and they would be escorted at gunpoint, the kidnapped or captured people, onto the slave ships, where the crew of the ship would then, use violence and threats to get the people on the boat and under control. All right. The pens that the slaves were kept in and the slave ships, just know that there were awful conditions in these slave castles and awful conditions in the slave ships. So the system that was used to transport African slaves across the Atlantic Ocean, that system was called the Atlantic slave trade. So that was the trading of enslaved Africans across the ocean to plantations in America. And that system started in the 1450s and ended in the 1870s. So when you really think about that, The shipping of slaves from Africa across the ocean lasted for almost 400 years. That's a very long time. That's longer than the United States has existed. And the system that was used or the reason why there were so many slaves from Africa sent to America was there was this economic system called the triangle trade. So it basically meant that the slaves from Africa were needed somewhere else. And the people in Africa who sold the slaves or traded the slaves had other goods that they wanted. So let's go through each one. So it says slaves from Africa were sent to America, the Caribbean islands, in exchange for raw materials. So the workers would get dropped off in America, and then the slave ships would pick up things like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, things that were grown in America. Then raw materials, or the crops that were grown, they were sent from America to Britain, right, Europe, where they would be traded for factory goods, things that were made in factories in places like Britain, things like clothing and liquor and guns, swords, weapons, knives, things like that. And then factory goods, things that were made in factories, would be sent from Britain, from Europe, to Africa, and those factory goods would be given to the African tribes in exchange for the slaves. So basically, you had 3 locations that all had one thing and needed something else, and ships would just sail in that sort of triangle and keep trading those goods. Historians call that the triangle trade. All right, next, let's go through some statistics. Okay, number 11 says, it is estimated that 10 million Africans were transported involuntarily, that means against their will, to the Americas, North and South America and the Caribbean. 10 million is a very large number. It's impossible to get an exact number, but we know that roughly an estimate is that 10 million Africans successfully arrived in the Americas. Number 12, it says New World Slave Destinations. The British 13 colonies, which became the United States, received a very small percentage of slaves transported out of Africa. Slaves sent to harsh climates died frequently. So if you were a slave and you were sent to a very warm climate where you grew sugar, chances are you weren't going to live that long because you were going to get worked to death and possibly catch a disease. But slaves that were sent to the 13 British colonies, they survived. And not only did they survive, but slaves married each other and had children. So slaves in the 13 colonies actually increased in population. And we know that by the Civil War, there were 4 million slaves in the United States. So when we look at the breakdown of where all the slaves went, 5 million of the 10 million slaves sent to America ended up on a Caribbean island. 4 million of the 10 million ended up in Brazil, the Portuguese colony in South America. The 13 colonies, what became the United States, only received 500,000 slaves from Africa, 5%. And then 5% of the slaves from Africa ended up somewhere else, typically in South America or Central America, somewhere like that. Okay, our last section for today is something called the Middle Passage. Okay, so the Middle Passage was the term that was used to describe the slaves' overseas journey from Africa to their destination in America on a slave ship. So for 13, the Middle Passage was the name for a slave's overseas journey across the Atlantic Ocean. It was called the Middle Passage because in that triangle trade between 3 locations, this passage from Africa to America was the middle stage of that triangle. For 14, it describes the awful conditions that slaves had to endure on slave ships. So in the video that you watched yesterday, you learned that slaves were crammed together and only had 4 square feet of space between them. And that was called tight packing. So the slaves were all crammed together. They went to the bathroom on each other, they vomited on each other, and disease spread very quickly. It says slaves were forced onto the top deck to dance with crew members. And the reason why that happened was because there was forced exercise. When those slaves landed in America, they were going to be auctioned off. And how much they would sell for would depend upon how healthy their bodies looked. As a result, if you were a crew member on a slave ship, you would have to force the slaves to dance. And think about it. If you're an enslaved person, the last thing you want to do is dance or exercise, but they would do that with the threat of violence. It says slave crews used extreme violence such as whipping to maintain control on a slave ship. Slaves became so desperate and so depressed that many slaves chose to kill themselves by jumping off the side of the boat and drowning. So this was an awful situation where these poor enslaved people were basically desperate to get out of it, right? Slave crews also would occasionally tie slaves to bags of rocks to drown them. Sometimes it was done for intimidation. Sometimes it was done to kill sick slaves so that slave crews could collect insurance money from them. And that's something I'll explain to you more in person. Lastly, the last little point here, number 15, because slaves were treated so poorly on these slave ships, slaves would get together and fight back. So the term mutiny is when there's a rebellion on a ship. So a mutiny is when a group of people overthrow someone in control of a ship. And slaves very frequently would fight back against the slave crews, right, to try to preserve their lives and preserve their freedom. So an example of this is when in the 1830s, a group of slaves aboard a ship called the Amistad basically rebelled and fought for their freedom. So what I will do is, in person, one of the days that I see you, I will show you a clip from a movie called The Amistad, where you can see what conditions were like on this ship, and I'll briefly show you how slaves fought back so that you can see how violent and how desperate enslaved people were. Okay, everybody, so hopefully you took a little bit from this lesson. Make sure you answer your questions about slavery, and make sure you turn in the answers to your questions when you are done. Thank you, and have a good day.